Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for stopping by the channel. So for this video, we're going to be checking out this Zenith Chronomaster Sport, which is the first time I've actually owned a timepiece from this formative Swiss luxury brand. And yes, there is some notoriety from this release coming from those Rolex fanboys, because at a glance, this watch does look fairly similar to a modern Rolex Daytona with the outline of the dial, this black ceramic bezel insert, and even the bracelet. Though to be completely honest, the Rolex Daytona doesn't do a lot for me personally, and if you hone in on the finer details of the Chronomaster Sport, I think you'll see that there's a lot to appreciate with this chronograph that's also distinctly different from the Daytona. Now, I don't deny that Zenith was probably very strategic about the release of a Chronomaster Sport last year, which is really at the height of the Rolex Daytona craze, and the value for those watches kept going up. But also, if you consider the history of a Daytona and how they utilized movements from Zenith back in the day, I can actually see why the Chronomaster Sports does exist, and I do think it offers a very good alternative for a lot of different consumers. So why don't we break down the numbers first, and then I'll give you guys some of my thoughts on what I really like about this timepiece and for some potential points for improvement as well. So you have a 41mm case diameter and a fairly short lug-to-lug distance or wingspan of 46.7mm to my calipers. Overall thickness is 13.9mm, which is sandwiched between sapphire on the case back as well as the top side of the watch. Now this top crystal is slightly domed and has an excellent anti-reflective treatment on it for very good viewing angles of the dial. The OEM bracelet sits between 20mm lugs, and that tapers nicely down to 16mm before you hit the clasp. Now the clasp is a simple friction fit closure with a fold-over security latch, and it does have a nicely applied Zenith Star logo on that. And there are 5 micro-adjustment anchoring points on this clasp for fine-tuning the fit of the bracelet, but sadly this requires the use of a strap changing tool, and this can't be done on the fly, which is a feature I would expect to see on a watch that retails at over 14,000 Canadian dollars. I also found the clasp to be a bit difficult to open and close due to the friction fit swing arm system, but that being said, I do find it low in profile and it does tie in nicely and wear comfortably on the wrist. And that brings me to the first point that I really enjoy about this particular watch, in that it's very comfortable wearing the chronograph on this supplied bracelet. Now, I had to give up a few watches to obtain this Chronomaster Sport, and one of them was the Omega Speedmaster, which is another classic chronograph, and I have to say that the Chronomaster Sport wears a lot more comfortable than the Speedy. And on the wrist, I would say that this watch does wear smaller than that 41mm case diameter would suggest, and this is probably due to the thick black bezel insert that's there, as well as the fairly truncated lugs. But it does work very well on my wrist size, which is 7.5 inches for reference, and it could easily accommodate wrists much smaller than mine as well. So the second aspect of the Chronomaster Sport, which I really want to touch on, is the overall finishing of this watch is absolutely spectacular. The polished and brushed elements on the case and the bracelet, as well as the dial, can really rival something like you would see on a Grand Seiko, who I consider to be the gold standard when it comes to finishing at this price segment. Each hour marker is applied onto the dial, is multifaceted and finely polished to reflect the light, and the hand stack also has sharply defined angles and are of high polish. And even the separate overlapping subdials has a lot of attention to detail that are paid to them, with the chronograph 60 seconds and minutes totalizer having red-tipped hands when you compare that to the constant seconds subdial. And the different colors of the subdials also somehow tie into the dial design beautifully and provide a little bit of visual contrast. And something you're not going to find on a Daytona is a date complication, and this is discreetly found between the 4 and 5 o'clock position, So it's there when you need it, but it's also unobtrusive when you don't. Now this brand also displays their in-house caliber 3600 movement through an exhibition sapphire caseback, which again, you're not going to find on a Rolex, and they've finished this movement to a very high standard. Now I won't claim to be an expert on Zenith chronograph movements, but from what I understand, this caliber 3600 does improve upon the El Primero caliber 400, while still having over 300 components to it. And this is a high beat movement, so it does beat away at 5 Hz, and it also has an astounding 60 hours of power reserve. And on my time grapher, this watch also runs very accurately, deviating no more than plus 1 or 2 seconds per day on average. Now the pushers for the chronograph also have a very nice detent to them, and utilizing the 1/10 of a second complication can be done with ease, and this is in combination with that black ceramic bezel insert that has very legible 1/10 of a second graduations. And this is in stark contrast to the Daytona, which utilizes a more traditional tachymeter scale on the bezel. Now I also appreciate that this watch is water resistant down to 100 meters, keeping true to that true sports watch aesthetic. And by contrast, some other chronographs that I've really enjoyed wearing, like the Speedy or like the Longines Big Eye, have much less water resistance, coming in at 50 or even 30 meters of water resistance respectively. Now this timepiece isn't perfect, so there are some elements of this watch that I would like to see improved. And I've already touched upon the bracelet clasp being average in terms of operation of the micro adjustment. And overall, the bracelet does borrow heavily from the Rolex Daytona aesthetic. Now that said, my preference is still to wear this watch on the bracelet, as it does nicely balance out the head of the watch, and it gives you some good wrist presence, coming in at 146 grams sized up for my wrist. This watch also does have lume. It is a sports watch after all, but I gotta say the overall intensity of a lume is not that great, and there's also not a lot of real estate on the dial to actually apply lume. Now the lume on the hands is sufficient, but it's not as impressive as other chronographs within this price point, so I do think that's a potential point for improvement by Zenith. Now going back to the functions on this watch, tracking 1/10 of a second isn't really that practical. In fact, the only thing that I can think of in tracking of that amount of time is how long it'll take you to hit that subscription button. But joking aside, I would have preferred that Zenith kept with the more traditional main chronograph seconds hand that only completed 1 full revolution every minute. And I get that this is really just a flex on the horological end of movement manufacturing to track 1/10 of a second. And I think this is more about precision than it is about practicality at the end of the day. And there is actually a silver lining in that I don't actually utilize chronograph complications that much. To me, this watch just happens to be a very nice and interesting dial with a high beat movement and is very accurate. So that about wraps up my review of the Chronomaster Sport, and I can actually recommend it to anyone who wants to try something a little bit different outside of your normal chronographs. This watch does have a very dynamic look to it with very impressive finishing and a movement that Zenith is very well regarded for. And I'm very happy to be experiencing this brand for the first time, and I do hope to review more models from Zenith on this channel in the near future. As always, please do share your thoughts on this watch in the comments section of this video. And as always, I look forward to catching you guys in the next video.